My name is Mara Ellison. I was 38 years old when my younger brother introduced me to a room full of donors, board members, and family friends as the sister nobody in the family talked about unless they needed something fixed. I remember the exact way he said it because that is the kind of line people later try to soften. "It's fine," he told the man standing beside him, smiling like he was sharing a joke polished in advance. "She's our family's difficult chapter." He said it lightly. That was the worst part. Not loud, not slurred, not angry. Just smooth enough to sound acceptable to anyone who had never watched a family train itself to dismiss one person so consistently that cruelty started passing for personality. The engagement dinner was being held in the glass conservatory of a private museum outside Savannah. Everything looked expensive in a way designed to seem effortless. Ivory runner cloths, low white orchids in shallow bowls, candlelight reflecting against tall windows darkened by evening rain. My future sister-in-law's mother had hired a string trio that stayed just quiet enough for people to keep gossiping over it without feeling rude. I had been there less than 20 minutes. I was still holding the place card they had almost forgotten to set out for me when Adrian spotted me near the back bar and crossed the room with that camera-ready confidence my mother had always mistaken for character. He had one hand at my elbow before I could step away. My glass caught against my bracelet and a drop of white wine touched my wrist. "Come here," he said. "You should at least meet someone important." That word told me everything. Important. As if the room had two kinds of people in it. Those who mattered, and those who should be grateful to stand near them. He guided me through a cluster of guests toward an older man in a midnight blue dinner jacket. Silver hair, pocket square folded with military precision. A face people instinctively arranged themselves around. I had noticed him earlier because the room kept subtly adjusting toward him the way rooms do around real power. Not loud power. Institutional power. The kind that never needs to introduce itself twice. My mother was already there. So was my father. And Leona, my brother's fiancée, stood half a step behind them with a smile so fixed it looked painful. Adrian kept his hand on my arm as if I might embarrass him by walking off. "This," he said, glancing at the man, "is my sister Mara." Then he laughed. "Our family's difficult chapter." My mother smiled first. Not shocked, not offended, amused. She touched the stem of her champagne flute and said, "She always was the serious one." My father added, "That's the diplomatic version." There it was, the little chorus. The rhythm I had heard in different forms since I was old enough to understand tone. Not quite denial of my existence, just a steady reshaping of it. I was not kind, I was severe. I was not observant, I was cold. I was not careful, I was exhausting. If I noticed patterns other people preferred to ignore, then the problem became my noticing. For 1 second, I could feel the guests nearest us go still in that particular social way people do when they sense something indecent happening in a polished room and want to see whether they will be required to react. I did what I had done my whole life. I stayed calm. I looked at the man in the dinner jacket and gave him a small, polite nod, ready to excuse myself before the humiliation could deepen into spectacle. But he did not laugh. He looked straight at me, and I watched recognition hit him so hard it almost rearranged his face. His posture changed first. Then the color drained out of him. His eyes dropped briefly to the place card still in my hand, then back to my face, as though he was checking whether some impossible detail had somehow become real. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of the casual confidence everyone else had been leaning toward all evening. "Miss Ellison," he said quietly, "I didn't realize you were related to Adrian." Nobody said anything after that. I can still hear the trio playing in the corner. I can still hear ice shifting in someone's glass behind me. I can still see my brother's smile break in pieces, not dramatically, just enough to show the machinery under it. Leona looked from him to me and back again. My mother blinked too fast. My father straightened in the defensive way men do when they sense status moving in the wrong direction and have not yet figured out why. The man extended his hand to me, and this time he spoke loudly enough for the small circle around us to hear. "It's good to see you again." Again. That single word landed harder than any insult my brother had planned. Because I had never mentioned him to my family. Not because I was hiding anything dramatic. Mostly because nobody in that house had ever asked enough real questions about my work to earn real answers. They knew I traveled. They knew companies called when they had problems no one wanted public. They knew I billed well and kept strange hours and turned down family vacations more often than I attended them. Beyond that, they preferred assumptions. Assumptions were easier. Assumptions allowed them to keep telling the version of me that made them comfortable. I shook his hand and said, "It's good to see you too, Mr. Vale." Adrian actually frowned then, a quick, confused crease between the eyebrows. He had expected a laugh, maybe a flinch, maybe one of those thin smiles people use when they have spent years being told not to overreact. What he had not expected was recognition. Mutual, formal, and witnessed. "If you're listening to me from somewhere far away, tell me where. I used to think shame traveled faster than truth. I know better now. Sometimes truth just takes the longer road because it insists on arriving complete." No one in that circle knew what to do next. It was my future sister-in-law who broke first. She stepped forward with a brittle little laugh and said, "I think there's been some confusion." But Mr. Vale never looked at her. He was still looking at me, not warmly exactly, but with the measured respect of someone who has seen another person under pressure before and remembers what it cost them. "There's no confusion," he said. Then he asked whether I had a few minutes later in the evening because he would value a private word. I said yes. My brother tried to recover. He made some joke about the world being small. My mother said something about me being full of surprises, which would have sounded almost tender to anyone who had not spent years hearing surprise used as a polite substitute for resentment. My father asked Mr. Vale how they knew each other, but the question came out too quickly, too eager, and for the first time in a long time I watched him realize he was not controlling the pace of a conversation. Mr. Vale answered simply, "Your daughter did critical work for one of my institutions during a difficult period." Your daughter. Not Adrian's sister. Not the family's difficult chapter. Not an afterthought in a navy dress standing near the back bar because her seat had nearly been forgotten. Your daughter. I saw my mother's face change at that. Not into pride. That would have required generosity. No, it changed into calculation. She was searching her memory for conversations she had not paid attention to, trying to work out whether there was some version of my life she could still absorb and present as partially hers. I knew that look. I had seen it before. The dinner manager announced that guests should begin moving toward the central table arrangement. A wave of motion broke the tension just enough for everyone to pretend nothing unusual had happened. That is one of the oldest tricks in families like mine. Keep moving. Refill glasses. Adjust napkins. Let logistics cover what honesty would expose. Adrian released my arm then, finally remembering I had one. He leaned toward me and forced a smile so tight it changed his mouth. What exactly was that? I looked down at the drop of wine drying on my wrist. "An introduction," I said. Then I handed my place card to the hostess because my assigned seat had been placed at the far end of a secondary table beside two distant cousins and a retired neighbor I barely knew. I should say that seating charts tell the truth about families faster than speeches ever do. Mine had my name printed in smaller font than the rest, as though even paper had been instructed not to make a fuss. The hostess, flustered, said there must have been a mistake. There had not been. But before I could answer, Mr. Vale stepped beside us and said, "Miss Ellison will be joining my table." He said it like a decision, not a favor. Across the room, I watched my brother go still. That was the moment I understood the night had shifted beyond embarrassment and into consequence. Not because anyone had defended my feelings. People like my family never move for feelings. They move for hierarchy, for witnesses, for reputational weather. Something had just changed in the room's internal map, and they all felt it at once. I took my seat 3 places down from Mr. Vale, under the soft gold light of the conservatory chandeliers, with the rain slipping down the glass behind us and my brother watching from across the room like he had opened a door in his own house and found a staircase he did not know was there. At that point, I still did not know how much of my life was about to collide with his. I only knew that for the first time in years, someone had interrupted the family version of me before it could finish speaking. And once that happens in public, the old story rarely survives intact. I should explain something about my family before I tell you what happened after that dinner, because people like my parents never create one humiliating moment by accident. They build toward it over years, quietly, repeatedly, in ways that sound harmless if you only hear one example at a time. Adrian was 5 years younger than me, and from the beginning he was treated less like a child and more like a bright investment everybody expected to appreciate. He was easy to display. Beautiful in the open way certain boys are when they are young. Charming early, quick with adults, quick with apologies too, which mattered more in our house than actual behavior. My mother loved how people responded to him. My father loved how easily he moved through rooms. By the time Adrian was 12, they were already talking about his future, as if it were a family project we were all meant to support. I was useful in a less decorative way. I remembered dates. I kept copies of forms. I noticed when tuition notices were wrong, when insurance renewals were missing signatures, when my father's office manager had double paid a vendor and no one had caught it. I was the one teachers trusted when group work was falling apart, the one relatives called when paperwork looked confusing, the one neighbors asked to read a contract before they signed it, then laughed and said I should have been born 40 years old. It sounds almost complimentary when I say it like that. It did not feel complimentary living inside it. In my family, usefulness was never the same as worth. Usefulness was something they extracted from me, often without gratitude, then acted inconvenienced by. My parents liked warmth when it reflected well on them. They liked sparkle, ease, performance. They liked children who made gatherings lighter, not more accurate. I was accurate. Even when I was young, I had the habit of pausing before I agreed with things that did not make sense. That alone was enough to make me, in my father's words, difficult. I still remember being 14 and standing in our kitchen while my mother wrapped a crystal bowl for one of her friends. Adrian had forgotten a school trip form again. The deadline was that morning. I had found it in the back seat of the car the night before, filled in the missing details, and left it on the counter with a pen where he could not miss it. He still missed it. My father found out at breakfast, looked at me instead of him, and said, "If you saw it, why didn't you make sure it was handled?" That was the logic in our house. If I noticed a problem and failed to erase it before anyone else had to feel inconvenienced, then the problem became partially mine. Adrian was forgiven because he was busy or young or not detail-oriented. I was held responsible because I had seen what was coming. That dynamic does something to a person over time. It teaches you that competence will never protect you from blame. It only expands the territory of what people think they can demand. By my 20s, I had stopped expecting fairness from them. That probably sounds sadder than it felt. There is a strange relief in naming a system clearly. It saves energy. I left for college in Boston, then spent years building a life so far from their habits that I could almost pretend none of it had shaped me. I studied organizational risk first, then moved into the kind of consulting work that sits at the uncomfortable intersection of operations, governance, crisis response, and institutional cleanup. That is a dry way of saying companies called me when something elegant on the outside had started rotting underneath. Payroll irregularities, vendor misconduct, compliance failures hidden by charismatic executives, boards that had mistaken polished updates for actual control, founders who called me too severe on Monday and begged me to stay by Thursday. That became my career. I was good at it because I had spent my entire life around systems that trained people to protect image over truth. Once you grow up in a family like mine, you get very good at hearing what is being avoided. I lived in Charleston by then, in a restored brick townhouse with warped original floors and a narrow back garden I almost never had time to enjoy. My workdays were long and strangely intimate. When a company is in trouble, you see people very quickly. Not just what they say, what they protect, what they rewrite, which facts they suddenly cannot remember. Which assistants know more than vice presidents, which invoices matter, which silences matter more. The funny thing is, my family never understood any of that. They heard consulting and translated it into something vague enough that they could dismiss it whenever convenient. My mother described me to relatives as someone who helped businesses with paperwork. My father once told a family friend I did compliance-adjacent work, as if he were talking about a hobby with a tax. Benefit. Adrian tended to call me when he needed something interpreted. A contract clause, a vendor dispute, a lease issue, a threatening letter from an event sponsor. He never framed it as asking for help. He framed it as temporary sibling collaboration, then spoke about the outcome later as if things had simply resolved. That was his real gift, rewriting effort into atmosphere. By the time he met Leona, the pattern was so old it barely needed language. She came from one of those families that treated money like staging. Not loud, tasteless extravagance, something more controlled. Better fabrics, better wine, better schools, better assumptions. Her mother chaired museum committees and hospital fundraisers. Her father had been dead for years, but his name still opened doors in Savannah and Atlanta. Leona herself was gracious in the way women are trained to be when they have spent their lives in rooms where mistakes are noticed quietly and remembered forever. At least that was the version she presented publicly. In private, she was sharper than people realized. Not cruel in an obvious way, just expertly calibrated. She knew how to place someone lower in a room without ever saying anything that could be quoted later. The first time I met her, she looked at my carry-on suitcase, then at my shoes, and asked if consulting kept me on my feet in a support capacity. I told her, sometimes. She smiled like she thought we understood each other. We did not. When she and Adrian got engaged, my mother treated the event as if the family had finally been invited into the version of itself she had always wanted to advertise. There were dinner reservations I was told about after they happened. Group photos I was asked to stand at the edge of. A bridal planning weekend where my mother said, "You probably won't enjoy it, but we should include you so nobody says anything." That line stayed with me. Nobody says anything. In families like mine, appearances were never maintained because people were kind. They were maintained because witnesses existed. Inclusion was often just exclusion with better table manners. The engagement itself happened at a restored river property outside the city, all white stone and lantern light and carefully staged intimacy. I remember because I arrived late from a client meeting in Raleigh and walked into the after-dinner drinks just as my mother was explaining to one of Leona's aunts that Adrian had always been the child with social instincts. I was standing close enough to hear her add, Mara was different. Bright, of course, but intense. Bright, of course. That phrase is its own category of insult. Something offered like compensation, a neat little ribbon tied around exclusion. Leona's family accepted me the way one accepts a weather condition that has arrived with the season, polite enough not to comment directly. Curious enough to ask questions that sounded innocent until you noticed their shape. Was I married? No. Had I ever thought about settling into something more stable? My work was stable. Did I travel alone often? Yes. That must be hard at my age. I was 38. My mother heard all of it and never once stepped in. Why would she? The questions reinforced the version of me she found most convenient. Capable. Yes. But somehow unfinished. Admirable in a bloodless way. The woman who made things run but did not belong in the center of anything beautiful. Then came the rehearsal problems. I was in New York handling a 3-day board review when Adrian called and, without greeting me properly, asked if I knew anything about event insurance riders for outdoor dining structures in coastal weather conditions. I said I knew enough to ask why. He told me not to go into consultant mode and then spent 9 frantic minutes describing a catering conflict, an alcohol permitting issue, a transportation vendor threatening cancellation, and a museum events coordinator who had stopped answering calls. I stood in the hallway outside a conference room with my laptop open against the wall and listened while my younger brother tried to sound casual about the fact that half his wedding weekend was balancing on bad planning and optimistic assumptions. He ended that first call with, "Can you just look at a few things?" A few things became nearly 6 weeks of unpaid rescue work. I reviewed contracts between flights. I caught a transportation clause that would have made the family liable if weather shifted shuttle timing beyond a narrow service window. I flagged a catering penalty buried in an appendix none of them had read. I noticed that the museum's liquor authorization only covered one of the 2 reception spaces because an earlier floor plan had never been updated. I found duplicate floral deposits and realized someone on Leona's side had approved 2 overlapping versions of the same design package. I spent 3 evenings in a row calling venue managers, insurance coordinators, and one patient woman in legal at the museum who had clearly been trying to get answers for weeks. Not one person thanked me directly. Oh, there were sounds approximating gratitude. Good catch. We'd be lost without your brain. This is why you're useful. But gratitude is not the same as being valued. Gratitude recognizes cost. What they offered me was consumption dressed as familiarity. One night around 11, Leona called me herself. That alone told me things were worse than anyone had admitted. Her voice was calm in the brittle way people get when the edge is near. The donor table placements are becoming politically sensitive, she said. I asked what that meant. She hesitated, then admitted a museum trustee expected a different seating arrangement than the one currently planned. A guest couple had been placed too close to a family branch with ongoing litigation over an estate, and one of Adrian's promised introductions to a financial backer of Leona's father's legacy fund had been mishandled so badly that the man was considering leaving after cocktails. I remember leaning back in my desk chair and closing my eyes, not because it was complicated, because it was so familiar. Once again, the family did not want my life, my mind, or my actual presence. They wanted my ability to keep a public failure from becoming visible. I solved that too. I rebuilt the seating flow with just enough diplomacy that nobody could point to a humiliation without sounding absurd. I drafted the message that reset the trustee's expectation while flattering his importance. I suggested moving one politically delicate couple to a smaller dinner the next evening under the language of legacy acknowledgement. I even wrote Adrian a short verbal script for approaching the donor he had neglected, because my brother, for all his ease in rooms, had never learned that charm without preparation is just improvisation with a better haircut. Every time I fixed something, my mother sounded relieved in a way that annoyed me more than panic would have. "You always know how to calm things down," she told me 2 days before the engagement dinner. That sounded kind on the surface. It was not. What she meant was simple. Clean up the part of the family narrative that threatens presentation. Make it smooth. Make it easy. Make it look natural. I said, "Someone should have checked all this sooner." There was a pause. Then she gave a little laugh and said, "Not everyone enjoys looking for problems, Mara." That was my mother's genius. She could turn vigilance into pathology so smoothly you almost felt guilty for noticing what needed noticing. By the day of the engagement dinner, I was tired enough that the edges of things felt sharper than usual. I had flown in that afternoon from Chicago after wrapping a client site review. I checked into my hotel, changed into a dark green silk dress I had not worn in 2 years, pinned my hair back, and told myself I would appear, remain pleasant, eat what was served, and leave before anyone found a new way to make me regret attending. I had no idea the dinner would become something else entirely. Looking back now, I can see that the humiliation in the conservatory did not begin there. It began in every smaller moment that taught my brother he could use me without respecting me. It began in every family gathering where my parents rewarded polish and punished accuracy. It began each time I was asked to fix something privately, then diminished publicly so no one would have to reconsider the story they preferred. By the time Adrian put his hand on my arm that night and called me our family's difficult chapter, he was not improvising. He was speaking from an old script everyone had helped him memorize. What none of them understood was that scripts fail the moment another witness enters with better information. And Mr. Vale had far better information than any of them realized. When I sat at his table that night, I still did not know exactly how he knew Adrian. I only knew he was important enough to make my parents careful and precise enough to make my brother nervous. He asked me 1 or 2 gentle questions during the first course, nothing that would draw attention. Whether I was still based in Charleston. Whether I was traveling as heavily as I used to. Whether I had any room in my schedule the following week. That last question sat between us longer than the others. Across the table, Leona kept smiling too brightly. At one point, I caught Adrian watching me over the rim of his water glass with a look I recognized from childhood. He wore it whenever he sensed that someone else in the room knew a version of me he had failed to manage. And for the first time in years, I had the distinct feeling that my family's version of me was not just being interrupted. It was about to become expensive. Mr. Vale did not approach me again until dessert was being cleared. The conservatory had grown louder by then. Candlelight had softened into that late evening blur where expensive rooms start looking slightly unreal. Chairs had shifted. Jackets came off. People who had behaved carefully through dinner were beginning to trust the wine. My mother was laughing too brightly at something one of Leona's cousins had said. Adrian had found his rhythm again, or was pretending to. From a distance, the evening might have looked repaired. It was not. I was standing near the side terrace doors, holding a cup of coffee I did not want, when Mr. Vale stopped beside me and asked whether I would mind stepping outside for a few minutes. He said it politely, but not casually. I set the cup down without drinking from it. The terrace overlooked the museum gardens. Rain had stopped, but the stones still held a dark shine under the low lights. The air smelled faintly of wet ivy and cold earth. Somewhere behind us, through the glass, I could still hear the trio moving through something soft and expensive. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I'm sorry for what happened back there." Not sorry in the abstract. Not one of those polished social apologies people offer when they want credit for noticing discomfort. He meant the specific thing. The public reduction. The witnessed insult. The fact of it. I said, "You didn't cause it." "No," he said, "but I recognized it." That landed harder than I expected. There are moments in life when someone names a pattern so cleanly that it takes effort not to react on the spot. I had spent years developing the habit of controlled expression. Not because I was naturally cold, but because too much feeling in the wrong room becomes usable information. Still, I had to look out toward the garden for a second before I trusted my face again. He waited. Then he told me why he knew my brother. His foundation had recently committed a substantial amount of money to a redevelopment project Leona's family had been promoting for nearly a year. Not directly through Adrian, of course. Men like Adrian are rarely the first point of contact in serious transactions. But my brother had inserted himself into the outer social layer of the project. Dinners, introductions, committee evenings. Strategic hosting. The kind of work people dismiss as atmosphere until they realize atmosphere is often where access gets traded. Mr. Vale said he had met Adrian 3 times before that night, and each time came away with the same impression. Smooth, charming, eager to be seen standing near importance. And not nearly as competent as the people around him seemed determined to believe. That was not new information to me. What was new was what came next. "There are concerns," he said carefully, "around the project's operating structure." I turned to look at him. He went on in that restrained way powerful people speak when they are deciding how much to say before they know who they can trust. There were discrepancies in budget summaries, delays that had been explained one way internally and another way externally, vendor relationships that looked overly familiar. Some communications had raised questions about whether decision-making authority was being represented accurately. "Nothing explosive yet," he said, "but enough for review, enough for discomfort, enough that my brother's name had begun appearing more often than was healthy for someone whose actual role seemed to change depending on who was asking." I did not answer immediately. That was not strategy, that was recognition. I had seen this pattern before. A socially fluent person orbiting a structure bigger than they had truly earned, growing bolder because no one wanted to puncture the mood early enough to matter. A family or institution covering the gaps because image had become part of the investment, people mistaking momentum for governance. He looked at me then and asked the question that changed everything. "Did your brother ever ask you to review anything connected to this project?" I thought back through the past 6 weeks. The wedding issues had been real enough, but now that he asked it that way, a few details shifted in my mind. Adrian sending me a draft vendor agreement and calling it just a hospitality logistics thing. Leona forwarding a reimbursement schedule with line items that felt unusually blurred. My mother, of all people, once asking whether a family foundation could temporarily bridge event-facing costs without creating unpleasant optics. At the time, I had treated each item as part of the wedding machine. Annoying, sloppy, inflated, but ordinary in the way rich families often confuse private celebration with institutional resources. Now it looked different. I said, "He asked me to look at documents." Not under that description. Mr. Vale's expression changed very slightly. Not shock. Confirmation. "Would you be willing," he said, "to review what you were sent and tell me whether you think there's overlap?" There are people who assume a question like that produces immediate adrenaline. It did not. It produced stillness. Because stillness is what comes right before I begin sorting things into categories. What I knew. What I suspected. What I could verify. What I would not touch without records. I asked him one question first. "Are you asking as a donor or as something else?" He gave the smallest pause. "As chair of the oversight committee, that is now trying to understand whether we've been handling a governance problem as if it were a social inconvenience." That was answer enough. I told him I would review anything I had been sent, but I would not speculate. I would not offer family interpretation. I would not become the emotional translator of my brother's behavior. If he wanted my eyes, he would get my work. Nothing more. He nodded once. "That is exactly why I'm asking." Back inside, the evening was beginning to loosen around speeches. Leona's mother was calling people toward the central area near the orchid display. Somebody adjusted a microphone. Somebody else clinked a glass. My mother caught my eye from across the room and gave me a sharp look that meant we would be discussing my terrace conversation later. I ignored it. I left before the toasts ended. No one stopped me. My hotel was 15 minutes away, in one of those restored inns that smell faintly of citrus polish and old wood, no matter how modern the plumbing is. I changed out of my dress, pinned my hair up, and sat cross-legged on the bed with my laptop open and my phone face down beside me. Then I started pulling everything Adrian and Leona had sent me over the past month into one place. Contracts first, then forwarded emails, then photo attachments of signature pages, then the expense summary Leona had called nothing formal, just a rough internal sheet. The phrase almost made me laugh now. There is no such thing as a harmless spreadsheet in the hands of people who rely on ambiguity. I worked until a little after 2 in the morning, not because the material was vast, but because the pattern was hiding in overlapping categories. Wedding-adjacent costs that did not belong where they had been coded. Hospitality expenses described one way in an attachment and another way in the body of the email. A vendor invoice routed through a third-party events company I could not immediately place. One consulting retainer that looked too large for what had supposedly been delivered. And beneath it all, the same tone I always recognize before the facts are complete, casual entitlement disguised as administrative mess. At 2:17 a.m., I found the first thing that made me sit back. A line item for guest experience staging support attached to a foundation-linked operations worksheet. The amount was not enormous, but the date matched a deposit correction I had made for one of Leona's private wedding vendors. Not identical wording, not identical recipient, but close enough to make my stomach go cold. That alone proved nothing. People love coincidence when coincidence protects them. So I kept going. A little before 3, I found an email chain where Adrian had forwarded me an event services agreement and stripped the header information before sending it. At the time, I thought he was being sloppy. Now I could see he had removed the part identifying the originating budget entity. In a separate attachment from Leona, the same vendor appeared under a different category code, this time linked to donor engagement planning. I stared at the screen for a long time after that. Then I made a folder. Not because I had made a final judgment, because I knew I was now in documentation territory. When I travel for work, I always carry a slim gray accordion file in my suitcase, insurance papers, printed itineraries, backup credentials, the kind of habit people tease until something goes wrong. I pulled it out, labeled one section with the project name as I knew it from their emails, another with the wedding vendor cluster, and a third with the word overlap. That word mattered. Not fraud, not theft, not misuse, not yet. Overlap. People destroy good cases by naming them too early. The next morning, I did not go straight to my mother's brunch. She had texted 3 times before 9 asking where I was and whether I realized it would look odd if I missed family photos. I sent back a single line. I'm not available this morning. No explanation. That alone was enough to trigger a call from Adrian. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice came in already irritated. What exactly did you say to Vale? The fact that he used Vale instead of Mr. Vale told me he was trying to reclaim ground in his own mind. I spoke with him on the terrace, I said. About what? Nothing that concerns you unless you've been careless. Silence. Then a short laugh, too fast. There it is. That tone. I leaned back against the headboard and looked at the rain marks still drying on the window. Adrian, I said, did you send me project documents under wedding descriptions? His reply took just a fraction too long. No. That was all I needed from the call. Not because lies prove everything, but because timing reveals confidence. Innocent people usually answer the whole question. Guilty people answer the narrowest possible version of it, and wait to see whether you have more. I said, all right. He pushed. That's it? For now. Then I ended the call before he could recover. By noon, I was back in Charleston. I had client meetings Monday morning and a scheduled risk review in Columbia the next day, so for 48 hours I did almost nothing outwardly unusual. That part matters. People think strategic action always looks dramatic. It usually looks boring. I answered emails. I revised a memo for a healthcare client. I returned a call from a payroll attorney in Atlanta. I watered the basil on my kitchen windowsill Thursday night and ordered Thai food from the place downstairs because I had no interest in leaving the apartment. All the while, I kept building the file. I requested original versions of a few attachments from my cloud backups. I checked metadata. I compared invoice numbers. I mapped the vendor names against public registration records and found 2 corporate officers linked across entities that should not have been linked casually. I did not hack anything. I did not trespass. I simply followed the trail people like Adrian always leave because they think social confidence can substitute for procedural discipline. By Friday afternoon, the pattern was no longer theoretical. The project and the wedding had not merely overlapped socially. Resources had been moving too loosely between them. Maybe not in the blunt, criminal way television prefers. Real life is usually messier. A reimbursement here, an event retainer there. A donor-facing budget category broad enough to hide vanity if no one asks unpleasant questions. Administrative pressure put on staff too junior to challenge it. Signature pages moved fast because everyone trusted the same last names. It was enough to matter. More than that, it was enough to trigger a review if it reached the right hands with the right framing. That evening, Mr. Vale called. Not from an assistant, not from an office line, directly. I answered from my study with the full file open on my desk and said, "I think you have a governance problem." He was quiet for a second, then said, "How serious?" I looked at the folders in front of me. The contracts, the staging invoices, the donor expense trail. The language Adrian and Leona had used when they assumed I was functioning as unpaid cleanup rather than an actual witness. "Serious enough," I said, "that if this stays in social channels much longer, you won't just have sloppy oversight. You'll have compromised records." He exhaled slowly. Then he asked whether I would be willing to meet in person the following Monday with counsel and one internal finance lead. Not to accuse, not to dramatize. To walk them through what I had identified, document by document, so they could decide next steps cleanly. I said yes. And after I hung up, I sat alone in my townhouse with the files still open and understood something that had taken me years to name properly. All my life, my family had depended on one assumption: that I would keep using my competence to protect them from the consequences of their own behavior. That I would fix quietly, absorb quietly, leave quietly, and never step fully outside the role they had assigned me. For the first time, I was not preparing to rescue the family version of events. I was preparing to separate myself from it. That is a much colder decision than anger, and much stronger. My mother called that night at 10:12. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear her tone before Monday. She skipped hello and went straight into complaint. "You left early, you missed brunch, and Adrian says you've been strangely hostile all week." I said nothing. Then she added, "I don't know what you think happened at dinner, but respectable people do not turn one awkward moment into a private campaign." There it was. Not what happened. What I think happened. Families like mine survive on revision speed. If they can redefine the event fast enough, they can keep the hierarchy intact. I said, very calmly, "You laughed when he called me the family embarrassment." Her silence lasted long enough that I knew she had not expected me to say it so plainly. Then she gave the answer I had heard in different forms my entire life. "Oh, Mara, it was just one of Adrian's jokes. You know how he is." Yes, I thought. I do. That was exactly the problem. I told her I had work to do and ended the call. On Monday morning, I walked into a private conference room in one of Mr. Vale's downtown offices carrying the gray accordion file from my suitcase and a legal pad with 12 numbered points on it. Not feelings, not family history, not interpretations. 12 points. 12 places where the truth had left fingerprints. And by the time I sat down across from counsel and opened the first section, I knew the story had crossed into a phase my brother would not be able to charm his way out of. Because once the right kind of people start taking notes, performance stops being protection. And Adrian had no idea that the woman he had publicly reduced to a family joke was now the most organized witness in the room. The conference room was colder than it needed to be. That is the first thing I remember about that Monday morning. Not because the air itself mattered, but because rooms like that are designed to flatten personality. Neutral walls, polished table. Water glasses placed at equal distances, no softness anywhere that might encourage people to mistake procedure for comfort. Mr. Vale had brought in general counsel, a senior finance director, and an outside governance specialist, whose face I recognized from 2 nonprofit oversight panels I had once been asked to brief. No one wasted time pretending the meeting was casual. That alone told me how far the situation had already moved. I set the gray accordion file on the table, took out my legal pad, and said, "I want to be very clear about what this is and what it is not. I'm not here to interpret my brother's character. I'm here to show you where records, descriptions, and routing patterns stop aligning." The outside specialist gave one small nod, the kind that says, "Keep going." So I did. I walked them through the event services agreement Adrian had sent me under a wedding heading after stripping the identifying header block. Then I laid it beside the donor engagement worksheet where the same vendor family appeared under a broader budget category. I showed how the timing lined up with a deposit correction I had been asked to help fix, and how the descriptive language had shifted just enough from document to prevent an inattentive reader from immediately recognizing the overlap. No one interrupted. That is always when I know a room has crossed from curiosity into concern. I moved next to the reimbursement clusters. Hospitality codes, guest experience staging, consulting support, travel adjustments. On paper, each one could have been defended as ordinary. But ordinary items stop looking ordinary when they repeat in proximity to the same names, the same entities, and the same dates. I had built the sequence carefully, not to make it dramatic, to make it undeniable. At one point, the finance director leaned forward, tapped a line item twice, and asked, "Why was this approved through a pathway that bypassed the standard review chain?" I said, "That's one of the questions you now need answered." He looked at Mr. Vale then, not at me. That shift mattered. For years, my family had trained me to explain away the thing under the thing, to soften, translate, and contextualize until other people could keep their innocence intact. In that room, I refused to do it. I gave structure. I gave sequence. I gave records. I did not give them emotional cushioning. By the time I reached point 9 on my pad, General Counsel had stopped drinking the coffee in front of her. She asked whether anyone else in the family knew I had seen these materials. I said no, not in this form. She asked whether Adrian or Leona had ever described the project to me in governance language. I said no. They had consistently framed documents as event-adjacent logistics, administrative cleanup, or donor-facing hospitality support. She wrote something down after that and underlined it once. Then Mr. Vale asked the question everyone in the room had been circling. "If we open this fully," he said, "what do you think happens next?" That is not really a legal question. It is a systems question. I answered honestly. "They will probably try to collapse categories," I said. "Personal into professional, wedding into donor cultivation, confusion into flexibility. They'll call it fast-moving planning. They'll say everyone knew more than they actually did. They may also try to reposition Adrian as peripheral, even if he has been acting central in rooms where that impression benefits him." The outside specialist asked, "And Leona?" I looked down at the page for a second before answering. Not to protect her, to be precise. "She understands optics well enough to know when a room can be guided," I said. "If she senses records are solid, she'll probably become narrower, not louder, selective memory, procedural regret, claims of misunderstanding. But if either of them thinks there's still room to turn this back into a family misunderstanding or a social misread, they'll use that opening." Silence again. Then Counsel closed her folder and said they would be initiating a formal review immediately, including a preservation notice and a full expense path analysis. The governance specialist wanted a vendor relationship map. Finance wanted controlled access to historical approvals. Mr. Vale said nothing for a moment. He just looked at the documents in front of him the way people do when they finally understand that a thing they hoped was merely awkward is, in fact, structural. Then he asked whether I would stay on as external operational reviewer for the duration of the assessment. Not advisor in the vague way families and institutions both love when they want labor without accountability. Reviewer. Named, bounded, formal. I said yes, with conditions. Everything in writing. No role in family-facing communication. No participation in disciplinary recommendations involving Adrian specifically. Full document access relevant to the scope, direct channel to counsel when inconsistencies appeared. He agreed before I finished. That should have felt satisfying. It did not. It felt clean, which is different. Clean is what truth feels like when it no longer has to ask permission. The review moved faster than I expected. Preservation notices have a way of changing the temperature around people. Systems suddenly matter. Deleted calendar entries become interesting. Version histories stop feeling invisible. Staff who were previously too nervous to speak begin answering direct questions with more care. Within 48 hours, the Foundation's internal team had identified additional routing anomalies I had not seen because I had only been working from what Adrian and Leona sent me. There were consultant hours billed through an affiliate firm with no clear justification. 2 hospitality reimbursements lacked supporting descriptions entirely. One donor-facing planning memo had gone through 3 different titles in 5 days, each version broader than the last. That kind of drift is never comforting. On Wednesday, I was added to a secure review channel with counsel, finance, and the outside specialist. No theatrics, just documents, timestamps, and precise questions. I spent 12 straight hours at my desk that day, shoes kicked off under the chair, reading, cross-referencing, flagging. Around 6 in the evening, I found the first direct indication that Adrian had knowingly misrepresented authority in writing. Not a confession. People rarely hand those over, but enough to matter. In one email, he referred to our internal approval for expenditures that, according to routing logs, had not passed the people empowered to approve them. In another, he implied donor-facing alignment that had not yet been finalized. Slippery language. Familiar language. The sort that survives in social circles because everyone wants momentum and nobody wants to be the first person to sound suspicious. By Thursday morning, they called Adrian in. I was not in that room. That was intentional and correct. But counsel briefed me afterward because part of my role was assessing whether his explanations aligned with the records. Apparently, he began exactly where I expected: minimal involvement, overstated assumptions, benign confusion. He described himself as socially supportive rather than operationally central. He implied Leona and her team handled most execution details. He said any blurred lines were probably the result of wedding pressure and overlapping calendars. Pressure. That word does a lot of work for people who are used to having consequences translated into circumstances. The problem for Adrian was that he had spent too long enjoying the authority of centrality while preparing none of the discipline centrality requires. The emails did not match the humility of his explanation. The introductions did not match the distance, he suddenly claimed. The phrasing in several documents used ownership language no peripheral participant should have been using. By the end of that first interview, counsel believed he was withholding. Finance believed the money trail was broader than initial estimates. Mr. Vale believed, though he did not say it in so many words, that the problem had entered reputational territory no family connection or polished apology would fix. Then Friday made everything worse. A staff coordinator in donor relations turned over a set of archived messages she had been too nervous to escalate earlier because, in her words, everyone acted like Adrian was protected. There it was again. The invisible architecture under so many institutions. Not formal power. Assumed immunity. The messages showed Adrian pushing for faster reimbursements under vague project labels, asking one junior employee to keep things moving without getting hung up in departmental choreography, and referring to my brother's favorite concept, flexibility, in contexts where flexibility clearly meant bypassing scrutiny. One of the messages mentioned Leona directly. Not enough to prove joint intent on its own, but enough to make the overlap between wedding prestige and institutional spending look less accidental than anyone had hoped. That afternoon, the review team scheduled a joint session for the following Tuesday. Adrian, Leona, counsel, finance, oversight, Mr. Vale, and me not as a family member, but as the external reviewer presenting the structural sequence. When counsel told me that, I sat very still in my office chair. Not because I was afraid of them, because I understood what the room would mean. My brother had spent his entire life speaking over me inside private family systems built to let him. Tuesday would place him inside a formal system where I would not need to raise my voice once. My mother called that night, and for the first time in years, I let it go to voicemail. Then my father called. Then Adrian. Then Leona. Surprisingly enough, around 10:40. I listened to none of them until later. When I finally played my mother's voicemail, her tone was already tense. I don't know what is going on, she said, but Adrian is very upset, and if you've involved outsiders in some misunderstanding, I think you need to remember that family matters should stay in the family. I replayed that sentence twice. Family matters should stay in the family. It sounded almost old-fashioned, honorable even. If you did not know what it really meant in our house, it meant keep the witness pool small. Keep the story adjustable. Keep the strongest person carrying what the least accountable people have spilled. My father's message was harsher. He said I had no right to weaponize technicalities against my own brother. He said successful people all understood that important projects got messy. He said if I damaged Adrian's future over administrative overlap, I would regret it for the rest of my life. Administrative overlap. That phrase told me more than anything else. Someone had already briefed him using softened language. The old family reflex was underway. Rename the behavior until conscience no longer has anything solid to grip. I deleted neither message. I saved both. Tuesday arrived gray and windless. The joint session was held in a private boardroom on the 9th floor of the foundation offices. Not theatrical, not grand, but serious in the way glass and silence can become serious when enough powerful people stop pretending a matter is personal and start recording it properly. I wore a charcoal suit and a cream blouse, no jewelry except small gold studs, hair pinned back, the kind of outfit that makes no emotional argument at all, just competence. Adrian was already there when I entered. He stood near the far side of the table with both hands flat against a chair back, too still to be comfortable. Leona sat beside counsel for her family's project entity, posture flawless, face composed into that same social grace she had used at every dinner and museum event since I had known her. But composition is easier to read once you've spent enough time around internal reviews. Perfect calm is often just fear with expensive posture. Neither of them greeted me. That was fine. I had not come to be greeted. The room settled. Water glasses. Folders. Screen awake at the far wall. Mr. Vale at the head of the table, not performing authority, simply inhabiting it. Council opened the session by framing the scope, expense routing concerns, authority representation, vendor alignment, a 4,500, donor-facing integrity, record preservation. She spoke for 6 minutes and never once used the word family. That omission mattered more than any confrontation could have. Because once a system refuses the emotional language people rely on, they lose half their tricks. Then she invited me to walk the room through the structural chronology. I stood, connected my laptop, and pulled up the first document. For the next 40 minutes, I did exactly what I had spent my whole career doing. I showed them the pattern. Not dramatically, not with anger, just one step at a time. Here was the original agreement. Here was the altered description. Here was the version stripped of identifying context before it was sent to me. Here were the reimbursement sequences. Here were the overlapping dates. Here were the vendor relationships across entities. Here were the phrasing shifts that widened definitions whenever scrutiny approached. Here were the emails implying authority before authority existed. Here were the messages pressuring junior staff to keep things moving without formal review. I never once looked at Adrian while I spoke. That, more than anything, seemed to shake him. He was used to family conflict as performance. I, contact, history, loaded tone. Hurt he could reframe as bitterness. But there was nothing for him to push against in what I was doing. I was not speaking as a sister asking to be treated fairly. I was speaking as a professional witness describing a system failure with his fingerprints on it. Halfway through, Leona interrupted. "You're making ordinary planning language sound sinister." I turned one page on the screen and said, "No. I'm showing how ordinary planning language was used inconsistently across contexts where the money trail required precision." Then I moved on. The room stayed quiet. A few minutes later, Adrian tried a different tactic. He said, "Mara has always had a tendency to interpret people in the harshest possible way." That line might have worked at our parents' table. It might even have worked in the conservatory. But in that room, with counsel taking notes and timestamps glowing on the screen behind me, it sounded exactly like what it was, not a defense. A family habit trying to survive contact with documentation. Mr. Vale spoke for the first time then. "Is any of the chronology inaccurate?" Adrian opened his mouth and closed it again. That was the moment the room changed. Not because anyone shouted, no one did, but because everyone present understood the question had forced a boundary he could not charm his way around. This was no longer about tone, resentment, interpretation, or sibling history. It was about whether the records were accurate. And they were. By the time I finished, even Leona's counsel looked tired. Finance asked 3 final questions about the reimbursement path. The governance specialist asked whether either Adrian or Leona had additional explanations for why donor-facing operational categories had absorbed costs with obvious personal proximity. Their answers were fragmented now. Narrower. Less assured. Adrian said he had trusted other people. Leona said the planning environment had been fluid. Counsel asked why, if it had all been innocent, identifying context had been removed from materials sent to me. Neither answered well. Then Mr. Vale folded his hands and said, very calmly, "We are past confusion." No one moved. He went on to say that, effective immediately, both Adrian's project access and Leona's family entity privileges related to the redevelopment would be suspended pending final review. All donor-facing communications would be centralized. External forensic accounting would begin that week. No one was to contact staff about the matter. No one was to reposition records. No one was to suggest informal cleanup. Then, and only then, he looked at me. Thank you, Miss Ellison. Not Mara. Not Adrian's sister. Not the family's difficult chapter. Miss Ellison. The same title my family had never once used for me in a room that mattered to them. Across the table, Adrian looked like someone had finally understood that the script he'd used his whole life had failed in front of better witnesses, and for the first time I could see it reaching him in full. Not just that he was in trouble, but that I had not saved him. The calls started before I got back to my car. Not dramatic at first, just persistent. Adrian twice, my mother once, then Leona, then my father. By the time I merged onto the freeway, my phone had lit up enough times that I turned it face down in the passenger seat and kept driving north with the radio off. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a public correction. Not peace, exactly. More like the air after something structural gives way. You can feel the space changing, even before the visible collapse begins. I knew Tuesday's meeting was not the end of anything. Systems do not move that way. There would be more review, more paper, more denial attempts, more frantic reframing. But the central shift had already happened. The family version of events was no longer the dominant record. The institutional one was. And my brother had no idea how to live inside a world where charm could not outrun a timeline. I got home just after 6, kicked off my shoes in the hallway, set my bag down by the umbrella stand. Then I stood in my kitchen for a full minute without turning on a light, watching dusk settle against the garden door while my phone continued vibrating on the counter. When I finally listened to the first voicemail, it was Adrian. He had started angry and ended scared, which is often how men like him sound when performance gives out before strategy does. I cannot believe you did that in there, he said. In front of those people. You could have handled this privately. You always do this, Mara. You make everything sound worse than it is, because you need to be right. I replayed just one part. You always do this. It was almost impressive, the instinctive reach for the old hierarchy. Even then, even after a room full of counsel, finance, and oversight had watched the record close around him. In his mind, I was still the sister whose job was to absorb, manage, and soften. Leona's voicemail was more controlled. She said the review had become disproportionate. She said outsiders did not understand family dynamics, and that I had allowed personal history to contaminate professional judgment. Then she said something that told me everything I needed to know about her actual fear. If donor confidence drops, she said, that kind of damage affects many people, not just Adrian. There it was, not remorse, not even direct denial, damage management. She was still trying to move the conversation away from conduct and back toward optics, which meant she had not fully accepted that optics had already lost. My mother called again at 7:14, and this time I answered. She skipped hello. What exactly have you told them? I was too tired to play the old game. The truth, I said. She exhaled sharply, almost a laugh. Mara, don't do that. Don't say truth like nobody else in this family has one. That line would have undone me 10 years earlier, not because it was wise, but because it was designed to blur the clean edge of what had happened. In our house, truth was always treated as plural the moment facts became inconvenient. Feelings, intentions, family perspective, context, stress, misunderstanding. Pile enough soft language over hard conduct and eventually people lose sight of what actually happened. I said, he called me your family embarrassment in front of donors and trustees. She was silent. Then, you know Adrian jokes when he's nervous. I closed my eyes. And he also moved money and authority around carelessly enough that council opened a formal review. That is not what I meant. No, I said, it never is. She changed tactics immediately. Hurt, injury, and maternal strain. She said I had always punished people too completely. She said she did not understand why I could never let one thing go for the good of the family. I listened without interrupting, because once you stop trying to be understood by people like that, they often become more revealing than they intend. At the end, I said only this. I am not doing this to the family. I'm just not carrying it for you anymore. Then I hung up. My father came to Charleston 2 days later, He did not warn me he was coming. Of course not. Men like my father believe proximity is authority. He arrived at my office a little after noon wearing a navy sport coat and the expression he used whenever he thought a private correction was overdue. My assistant buzzed me and said, carefully, "Your father is here. He says it's urgent." I told her to send him in. He walked into my office, looked around at the shelves, the framed credentials, the city map, the neat spread of files on my desk, and somehow still managed to carry himself as if he were entering a room I had borrowed from more serious people. He did not sit until I offered, and even then he lowered himself into the chair with visible irritation. "This has gone far enough," he said. "No greeting, no pretense." I folded my hands on the desk and waited. He said Adrian was being unfairly targeted because donors wanted someone to blame. He said Leona's family was panicking and overcorrecting. He said strong projects always created enemies. Then he leaned forward and used the tone I had known since childhood, the one meant to make refusal sound immature. "You are going to call Vale," he said, "and tell him this has become personal. You are going to make it clear your history with Adrian affected your judgment." I remember looking at him and feeling almost nothing. Not rage, not sorrow, just distance. Because for the first time, he was not speaking inside the old house. He was speaking in my office, in the middle of a life he had never bothered to understand, asking me to damage my own credibility so that his son could avoid consequences. I said, "No." He stared at me, then gave a disbelieving smile. "You don't even have all the facts." "I have enough." "You always think that." "No," I said. "I document that." That line landed. His face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to see the crack under the confidence. He was not used to me refusing him without apology. He was even less used to doing it without emotion for him to exploit. He tried shame next. Said family loyalty seemed to mean very little to me. Said Adrian had his faults, but blood should still count. Said no outsider would ever stand by me the way family does. That one almost would have been funny if it had not cost me so much of my life. I said, "Family has stood near me. That's not the same thing." He stood up so quickly the chair legs scraped the floor. "You are enjoying this." There it was, the accusation people make when they cannot control the difference between justice and revenge. If you refuse to resume the role that kept them comfortable, they call your boundary cruelty. I stayed seated. "No," I said, "I'm just not interrupting the truth for you." He left without another word. After that, the fallout accelerated exactly the way these things usually do. Not all at once, in layers. The foundation brought in forensic accountants. The review widened. 2 additional vendors were flagged for irregular routing. One junior staff member confirmed she had been told to treat certain private hospitality costs as donor cultivation support because the categories would be reconciled later. Another employee produced a draft calendar showing donor meetings blended deliberately with wedding-adjacent events to justify staffing and transport usage. Adrian's access was fully revoked by the end of the week. Leona's family issued a private statement to key stakeholders, calling the redevelopment project under structured review. That language told me they were trying to keep reputational bleeding contained while preparing for something worse. Within 10 days, 2 major donors paused participation. Not because the numbers were catastrophic on their own, but because trust is rarely destroyed by one line item. It is destroyed by the realization that people in charge were using vagueness on purpose. Then came the social unraveling. Museum friends stopped returning calls as quickly. A committee dinner was quietly postponed. A host list shifted for an event Leona's mother had expected to anchor. One of Adrian's close business contacts sent him a message that leaked back through mutual acquaintances, saying he needed to create distance until the review concluded. That phrase, "create distance," spread through their world like perfume. Nobody announced condemnation. They just adjusted seating, invitations, and timing. People of that class almost never exile you loudly. They simply remove access until you begin noticing doors no longer open with the same ease. My mother hated that part most. Not the review, not the money trail, the social cooling. She called me one Sunday afternoon and cried for nearly 15 minutes about how cruel people were being to Adrian, how unfairly Leona's mother was being treated, how nobody understood the pressure young couples faced trying to build a life in those circles. Those circles. I thought about the conservatory, the orchids, the seating chart, the way she had laughed when he introduced me as the family's difficult chapter. I said, You still think this is happening because the room became impolite. She did not answer. 3 weeks after the joint review session, council sent formal notices. Adrian was named in findings related to misrepresented authority, improper expense routing involvement, and procedural interference. The language was careful, institutional, but the message was unmistakable. He would not be returning to the project in any capacity. The foundation reserved further options depending on final recovery analysis and partner disclosures. Leona was not criminally accused of anything, at least not from what I later understood. But her family's project entity was hit hard enough that she became expensive in all the ways that matter to polished people. Risky, embarrassing, too closely associated with confused records and donor unease. Her engagement to Adrian ended 6 weeks later. Not in a dramatic scene, not with smashed glasses or screaming phone calls. Just a statement released through families who still cared more about language than pain. After careful reflection, they have chosen to move forward separately. That kind of sentence always fascinates me. It sounds civilized enough to pass at lunch tables while containing a whole private collapse. Adrian called me the night it ended. I almost didn't answer, but something in me wanted to hear what remained when all the room management was gone. He sounded tired, truly tired, not performatively wounded, just stripped down to a version of himself I had not heard since we were children. She left, he said. I did not say I know. He asked if I was happy now. There was a long pause after that. Long enough that I think he expected me to deny it too quickly, to reassure him, to step back into some softer shape that would let him avoid seeing what was actually between us. Instead, I told him the truth. No, I said. I'm relieved I don't have to keep pretending anymore. He started crying then, quietly, which unsettled me more than anger would have. He said he had not meant for any of it to get that far. He said things had blurred gradually. He said Leona expected a certain level of presentation. He said our parents always treated him like he had to be impressive, and after a while it became easier to borrow certainty than admit he didn't actually have it. I listened, because all of that may even have been true. But truth about why you became dangerous is not the same as innocence once you are. I told him he needed people he had not used up. An attorney, a therapist, an accountant. Maybe one real friend if he still had one. But I was not the person he got to reach for now. He asked, "So that's it?" And I said, "That should have been the question years ago." Then I ended the call. My Aunt Eleanor invited me to dinner about a month later. She lived on Hilton Head in a low white house full of quiet furniture and books nobody touched carelessly. She was my mother's older sister and one of the few people in the family who had ever seen what was happening without trying to turn it into personality. Not perfect, not brave enough when I was younger, but honest in the end, which counts for more than people admit. Over sea bass and roasted carrots, she told me things I had suspected but never had confirmed. My college housing deposit had been delayed 1 year because my parents redirected money to cover one of Adrian's networking trips. A small inheritance from my grandmother that should have come to me directly at 25 had been merged into family support decisions and partially used to stabilize a business idea Adrian abandoned 8 months later. The expensive graduate program my mother always praised him for earning into had included more hidden family subsidy than anyone ever said aloud. I sat there very still while she spoke, the fork cooling in my hand. It did not shock me exactly. It clarified me. That is different. Because the story my parents told for years was that Adrian rose because he was brighter, warmer, better suited to opportunity, but what Eleanor laid out was simpler and uglier. They had funded the illusion, then praised it as destiny. When she finished, she reached across the table and touched my wrist. "You were never hard to love," she said quietly. "You were just hard to use without guilt." I cried in the car after that. Not long, just enough. Some grief only arrives once the evidence is complete. By the end of that year, my life was smaller in the best way. Quieter mornings, cleaner weekends, fewer calls I dreaded answering. I kept my work. Expanded it, actually. Mr. Vale asked if I would consider a retained advisory role for governance and operational risk across 2 affiliated institutions. I accepted, but only after the scope was defined clearly and the reporting lines were written cleanly. He never once treated me like a grateful recipient of rescue. He treated me the way I had always wanted to be treated by my own family, as someone whose judgment had weight because it had been earned. I went low contact with my parents first, Then no contact after my father sent one final email blaming me for choosing strangers over blood. I changed my number, filtered their addresses, moved apartments the following spring to a narrower brick place closer to the water, with morning light in the kitchen and enough room for a long table no one was invited to if they believed access was a birthright. Sometimes people ask whether I forgave Adrian. I think that is the wrong question. Forgiveness is private. Access is practical. I can hope he becomes someone truer than the man my parents trained him to be and still never let him near my peace again. The last time I saw him was nearly a year after the review, outside a charity lecture in Atlanta. I was there for work. He was standing alone near the side entrance in a plain coat that didn't quite fit, and a face finally free of the assumption that rooms would arrange themselves around him. He saw me, nodded once, and did not come over. I respected that more than any apology he could have made in public. Because some forms of respect arrive late and still count. He had once introduced me as the family's difficult chapter because he thought the loudest people in the room got to decide who mattered. He was wrong. What matters eventually is record, pattern, conduct, who built, who borrowed, who kept steady when performance stopped working. I did not destroy my brother's life. I stopped protecting the version of it that depended on my silence. And in the end, that was the real shift. Not the boardroom. Not the donors. Not even the engagement falling apart. The real shift was much quieter. It was coming home one evening to a place no one in my family had keys to, setting my bag on the counter, opening the windows to let the salt air in, and realizing nobody who had ever reduced me got to narrate me anymore. That kind of peace does not look dramatic from the outside. But it is.